It's my honor and my privilege to introduce our speaker today, John Tyler. John comes to us from the great land to the south of us, and it is a great land. There may be a few things happening these days that we wonder about, but what else will we do on late night TV? So I have to give thanks for that. And thanks, John, for coming. He's had quite a journey in life. We found out that we sort of parallel each other a little bit. He was a labor organizer. I was a labor organizer. He spent some time in Pittsburgh, and I was with the Steelworkers Union that used the services of the university in Pittsburgh for the health and safety of working people in Canada. And so we had a bit of a conversation about that. We talked a bit about his history in Pittsburgh and trying to form communities that are multicultural, we might say, or intercultural might be a better word. Communities where folk from different places in the world and different backgrounds in community can live together in relationship, still hold their own culture as they should, their teachings from their ancestors, but share that in deep curiosity and appreciation with one another. I think John's journey in life sounds to me like one of deep curiosity and appreciation, of thinking about where we are in relationship with one another, with the Creator, and how we can engage the power of love that invites us all into life and into deeper mystery, how we can engage that in our own journeys, and how, as part of the world, we can engage the whole world in it, that one day we might all live together in love and curiosity, as the people of this place say, employing the gifts of generosity and kindness, respect, and love. So thank you for coming, for taking what I understand was a fairly arduous journey yesterday to arrive here through many stops and starts to get here and to be part of our community for this time. So John, without much more, come on up.
Keith, thanks very much for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it very much, and it's good to be in the land of the north, to the north. Of the north, and I'm discovering all kinds of qualities that I wish we had a little bit more in that land of the south of. And it's just a delight for me to be here in Duncan, discover your lovely space. Yesterday I saw rhododendrons of every possible color, absolutely gorgeous, and I'm told that was just a hint of the beauty that you have here. And we're going to be talking about identity, but before we get into some of the details of that, I'd like to just describe a little bit of the format. Christian Science churches have lecture committees, and the lecture committees plan, well, they don't like it to call it a lecture. And somehow today we've arrived at a point where people don't like to be lectured to. So they usually try to find another word. Talk, maybe, sometimes symposium, seminar. Just get away from that term lecture. And what I'd like really to do with you this morning is to delve into some problems that I think are pretty complex, not beyond solution, but I'd like to reason, and I say this because we're a small enough group, and I think if, as I'm going through my reasoning from point A to point B to point C, and for you there's no logic in the point B to point C, we're a small enough group, raise your hand, we can deal with it. If you have a question, chances are there are others who have a similar question. And if we do that, then we can be together in this reasoning process. And for that reason, I like to call it a think. So if you're in agreement, and I hopefully, there will be a question-answer period at the end in any case. But again, if we're together logically and as we're going through that, it'll be a lot easier for everyone. Well, identity is a subject that has intrigued the world increasingly, I think, over the past several generations. There's a French novelist, well, actually French-Lebanese novelist called Amin Maalouf, who wrote a book called Murderous Identities. And he was referring, of course, to the the tendency in the past several generations, in fact, not at all limited to the immediate past, it goes back to the whole history of man, but in which identity itself becomes the basis of violence. We can see that in the Mideast today, of course, and we're hearing about it almost constantly. But it's hardly new. There have been expressions of this in other parts of the world on a fairly consistent basis. It's a question that has intrigued the nationalities. Under President Sarkozy in France, there was a ministry of national identity. And it was charged with trying to find out what did it mean to be French. How could we define the French identity? And it might be helpful just right at this very outset of our exploration to find out how you identify yourself. What are the characteristics? Now, this is just going to be very superficial. So let's just see how imagine it in different ways, the way in which you think of yourself, the way in which you might describe yourself to someone on the phone who doesn't see you physically or doesn't know you, other characteristics. What are the things which you think identify yourself?
I don't know, like our height.
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 Okay, height.
You know, hair color.
Hair color.
Eyes, all that stuff.
All kinds of physical
So
characteristics.
If they're going to find me on the street, they can sort of recognize what am I looking like.
Okay. Good. And this is, we can generalize this. This is kind of the way we see each other, the way we use our physical sense of sight and identify shape, color, all kinds of things. Okay, what else?
Smile.
Smile. That's a wonderful thing, to be able to be identified by your smile. Yes?
Gender.
Gender. This is increasingly kind of an issue even. Yes, exactly. Good. What else?
Friendly voice.
Friendly voice. And?
Your voice.
Pardon?
Your voice.
Voice. So something we can hear physically. Yes?
I'd say a job, career for disabled people.
Yes, what we do.
If they're, what side of the street they live on, their income is.
What they earn, yes. Sometimes even what they drive. Yes, behind.
Perhaps by our spiritual identity.
Okay, and we're going to be talking about that. And what might some of those characteristics be?
Your kindness, your understanding.
Kindness, understanding, spiritual understanding, or intelligence.
Different cultures.
And cultural characteristics. And we could go on. There's an almost infinite variety of ways in which we can identify ourselves. And the reason I think it's helpful just to get some of these things out so that we can recognize that there is a wide variety, that a certain number of these characteristics have to do with the way in which we see or physically identify. The information, let's say, that comes to us through our physical senses, voice, smile, though that represents some inner characteristics as well as some of the spiritual qualities, and like kindness, love, generosity, and so forth. And what I'd like to suggest is that this combination of qualities, which are the ways in which we identify ourselves, in which we discover who people are, and we use those terms, created for Christ Jesus a problem. He found that this was this way of our identifying ourselves actually was impeded his ability to get his message across. He found that there were ways in which people identify. One of the prime characteristics in his day of identifying one was the tribe that you came from. And tribe is understood in a very limited sense, usually the family, the father. And father in Jesus' time meant somewhat has different connotations than it has. For us, it has especially an immediate progenitor, our genetic source. We do talk about forefathers and so forth and refer to the ancestry in both a physical and symbolic way. But in Jesus' time, this was the prime characteristic of identifying anyone. And, from reading the New Testament, referring to Jesus, or John, son of Zebedee, Simon, Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah. This was the means by which we identified people. It was knowing where they came from and where they came from genetically. This is their family. But it told us more because we know their family, and then we know some of the characteristics that presumably characterize them as members of that family. And he wanted people to get away from that. This was a problem. If people saw themselves, you see, and I'm going to use a term that I know is horribly overused, I'm not sure overused, but used a great deal, but so much so that its meaning is debatable today. It's still an extraordinarily important term, and that's child of God, son of God, daughter of God. And this was what he was trying to get his listeners to identify themselves as. And that meant not just, you see, the problem with that term is it's so often used, it's kind of lost the basic meaning that Jesus gave to it. Jesus was insistent on the idea that didn't mean in any physical way. And in fact, when he speaks about the way in which people were to identify themselves, audibly but also mentally, was as within a spiritual family. He said, this is from Matthew 23, call no man, if I can get a hold of it, call no man father upon the earth, for there is one Father which is in heaven. Call no man father upon the earth. He wanted to get people away from seeing themselves as somehow descendants and therefore defined by family relationship, which was the crucial identification of his day. And I think today, if he were talking to us, 3/4 of those things that you identified as ways in which you might identify yourself or others are things that he would want us to get away from as well. In fact, when you come down to it, all of that information which comes to us through our physical senses, he wanted us to turn away from. Because otherwise, we would think of ourselves as somehow physical beings. And, well, at this point, I want to introduce a metaphor, because we're getting into kind of a little bit complicated territory here. And I want to talk about an incident which took place towards the end of the 19th century in India. It was the discovery of a child which had been raised by a pack of wolves, later called the wolf boy. It was discovered that this individual, they came across him apparently when he was about 9 or 10. And somehow this was, well, they speculate this is a time in Indian history, Hinduism, of course, the religion, in which it's forbidden to kill animals, so packs of wolves were common throughout certain portions of India. And in this particular area, they suspected that it was perhaps a young family with a newborn, maybe a few weeks old, that was going to work in the fields, and they'd laid the child down beside the field. And a she-wolf came along, who perhaps had lost her cub, picked the child up, as she-wolves do, by the back of the neck, and took him home to her den. Well, that's all speculation. Of course, what we do know is that this human being had never had the opportunity to walk on 2 legs. He ran on all 4. He was wild. He was ate raw meat, communicated easily and naturally with the wolves. He thought, and behaved as a wolf, could run as fast as the wolves. He was captured, he was wild, he was placed in a missionary family, and fortunately the missionary kept a very detailed diary of the experience that they had, and this lasted for several years. Just parenthetically, this is not an unusual circumstance. There's a whole field of study that's called feral behavior, wild children, children who have been brought up by wolves, gazelles, lions. There are hundreds, and there's quite a bit of data that we have on them. This is a particular circumstance, however, in which the data was captured in this detailed diary, and we can follow the gradual evolution of this child. As in this particular case, it was a fortunate one. The missionary's wife was an extraordinarily loving individual. Now, I say this because in many of these instances, the wild child didn't survive. The few of the cases I know of where they did, there was this presence of an individual with infinite patience, a quality of generosity and love that, in the case of this, the wolf boy was willing for months to massage his back to the point where finally he was able to walk upright. He was at first so wild they couldn't keep him in the house. He was in a stall beside the house. But gradually, he was able to begin to behave like a normal human being. There's a very touching moment in the missionary's account where they see what they feel is the first real sign of humanity, a tear in the child's eye. Well, won't go into further detail with regard to the wolf boy, but I would like at this point to kind of suggest a crazy idea. Imagine, each one of you individually, that you were born into somehow a purely spiritual family. Not material, it's difficult to conceive of, but just let's see if we can begin by imagining this phenomenon. And somehow, it was so long ago, maybe you were only a week or so in the family, but a human being had come along, picked you up, perhaps not by the nape of the neck, but took you home as their own child and brought you up to learn that you were a human being. You have almost no memory whatsoever of your real origin. But here you are, having grown up to see yourself as a human being, to have learned that you have physical senses, which are the prime means of identifying who you are. And this is, I think, essentially what Jesus is trying to tell us. That we should, the particular details of how we imagine this are not important, but that we should become aware of what it really means to be a child of God, in this almost literal sense, a creation of God. Now, in order to understand this in Jesus' terms, and what I'm doing here is I'm following a teaching from the individual whom I consider the most extraordinary and reliable theologian of modern times, Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the church sponsoring this lecture, the Religion of Christian Science, and an individual, really an extraordinary individual to become a world-known theologian. She did, it's true, grow up in a very religious family in New Hampshire, but I think if you were to asked her at various stages of her existence before the age of 45, if she were to be known as a real scientist, as an extraordinary theologian, she would have laughed. She would have, thought that was absurd. And yet, that is what she became. I refer to the age of 45 because this was the age, she lived to be 90, the exact big point in her career, in her life, when she made what she later described as a theological breakthrough. An awareness of a dimension of Jesus' teaching, which, even though she'd grown up in this very religious family, she'd never experienced. And it was the particular circumstances of this discovery. She had a variety of problems in growing up, many physical, and had turned to God in prayer for the solution of these problems, and found sometimes temporary relief, never of a permanent nature. Had turned often to the forms of medicine of her day, again with sometimes temporary relief, but again never of a permanent nature. And then this experience in 1866 came along, in which she had a severe accident, was given 2 or 3 days to live by her physician. And as was her habit, she turned to the Bible for help of any kind. And in reading one of the healings of Jesus, she came to understand this aspect of his teaching as teaching, not as some kind of supernatural ability, but as something that Jesus' students would be able to understand and put into practice. And it had a great deal to do with the way in which we are able to perceive or understand spiritual phenomena. She called it spiritual sense. And she describes spiritual sense as a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. It's really sensing good. The religion that she didn't intend in the beginning to form a religion, but, well, you can imagine a woman, late 19th century, no formal theological background, coming to Christian churches with this wonderful insight that she felt it was just something, they had the core of Jesus' teaching, but there was this aspect, this revolutionary aspect that she had discovered, and that they would presumably be delighted to at least explore. But of course, the doors were slammed in her face. And so finally she decided, well, if this were not to be lost again, part of Jesus' teaching, then there needed to be a framework, a church that could really help maintain an understanding of this dimension. And we're not going to be able to explore it very deeply, but I want to read you just a passage of a book that she wrote. She wrote quite a number of books, but there's one called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures that is the kind of the center of her teaching. It's the other books she published, and this was a book that she published and then edited and re-edited, and she wanted it to be a kind of a manual of understanding. That subtitle, The Key to the Scriptures, Understanding the Bible, a means of really opening the Bible to understand its treasures. And so this is just 2 sentences from Science and Health describing how Jesus healed. She says, Jesus beheld in science, and by in science she means from a purely spiritual perspective. So Jesus beheld in science the perfect man who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. Then in the next sentence, she kind of gives the key to his healing method. She says, in this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness. And this correct view of man healed the sick. Okay, so the verbs that she uses here have to do with sight, behold, see, and so forth. But obviously it has nothing to do with the physical sense of sight. It has to do with this thing that she calls spiritual sense. Using a spiritual sense to see, to somehow understand, grasp, appreciate the real nature of this individual of God's creation, the child of God. Now, there's something which I think can help you, because it's a challenging thing to understand, but to help you get a feel for what she meant by spiritual sense, let's just kind of conduct a mental experiment. Imagine that you have an opportunity to speak with two individuals. They're not twins, but they could be twins. They look very much alike, same gender, same race, same build, same age. You speak with them, let's say, for 5 minutes. And you come away from that conversation with the recognition that one of those two you were on the same wavelength. It's the kind of person, again, a superficial conversation, but you feel, a sense of integrity. The other, not quite so much. Not the kind of person you'd want to leave holding your wallet while you took a swim. Now, you haven't had that exact experience, but you've had many experiences of a similar nature. The reason I set it up in such a way that they were so similar is because I didn't want you to imagine that there were, somehow communications of a physical nature that told you. But because you have had that experience, you have felt those qualities of integrity. What is it that enabled you to sense that?
Spiritual sense.
Spiritual sense, exactly. And what's really interesting to me is that in Jesus' teaching, I had quite a number of years teaching at the university level, and I recognize in Jesus' teaching something that I felt very often, that is frustration, when my students didn't get kind of the core point of what I was trying to teach. If they didn't get some of the more advanced concepts, that was understandable. But the most important thing, and the thing that I usually started with and was the basis of understanding everything else, if they didn't get that, I got very frustrated. And you can feel Jesus' frustration in the same way when he is trying to get his students to use their spiritual sense, and they don't do it. And unfortunately, we live in a world in which there's so many other influences on us that we often neglect to use that spiritual sense. One of the instances, there's a case where Jesus has given a rendezvous to his students. They're going to meet later in the evening. And the students themselves have worked out a process whereby there's one of them who is responsible for bringing the bread to the evening meal. And Jesus has had a meeting with the Pharisees, and he's kind of anxious to tell his students about that when he meets them. He wants to warn them, really, and he's trained them to use their spiritual sense, and also because it's so difficult to speak of purely spiritual phenomena with a materialistic language, which is the nature of all languages. It grows out of our experience with the material world, that he's trained them to understand symbols. And he teaches, through parables, through stories, through symbols, metaphors. That's the way of communicating within the context of a material world, purely spiritual ideas. So at any rate, he's excited to warn them, really, about the thinking of the Pharisees. And so he comes and talks about the leaven, his symbol for that mental activity that is going on in the Pharisees. He wants to warn them of that, and he mentions that leaven. And his students, rather, think he's talking about the bread that their appointed preparer for the evening meal forgot. And he's not too happy. Eyes ye have and ye see not, ears ye have and ye hear not. It wasn't their physical eyes or ears he was talking about. It was their spiritual sense. And he wanted them to be able to use it. He'd been training them. This is something, it's something we all have, everyone. And it's something that we often use unconsciously. But he had been training them to use it consciously. There's another point I'll just mention briefly, because to me it's kind of the most heartrending point in the whole New Testament. It's when Jesus, it's the eve of the crucifixion, and he's going to be leaving his disciples, his students, the next day. He's talked about the way, and Thomas, not the swiftest of his students, asks him about the way, and Jesus explains that he's told him this already many times. But he explains patiently again, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But at that point, Philip, who is one of the sharper students, pipes up, and Jesus has referred to the Father. Philip says, show us the Father. And that's when Jesus responds, Philip, have I been so long time with you, and thou hast not known me? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That was that clear identification. He was expecting Philip, at least, to be able to use his spiritual sense and recognize, of course, man is made. That's what Jesus was teaching, in the image and likeness of God. And that's the sense that they needed to be using when they were identifying anyone, and especially him. Well, this spiritual sense was the key, as Mary Baker Eddy identified, the key to Jesus' means of healing. In this religion of Christian Science, which she founded, there isn't any clergy, but there is a kind of position, a career, if you will, that is called a practitioner of Christian Science. And these are individuals who establish a basis whereby, on a full-time basis, they avail themselves to the public as individuals who will help through prayer to resolve any kind of problem, not just for Christian Scientists, for anyone, and not just for physical healing, but for this resolution of any kind of problem, marital, financial, educational, career. And I want to just describe for you some time ago had begun as a Christian Science practitioner, and one of my early patients lived at some distance, so he called me by phone. He was a high school student, very enthusiastic soccer player. I'm glad that you refer to soccer still as soccer, not as football, because that's often a confusing factor here. But he was a soccer player who had broken his ankle. He wasn't a Christian Scientist, but he'd heard that Christian Science heals, and he asked me if I wouldn't heal him. And I explained that I wasn't a healer in that sense, that God was the healer, but that I'd be happy to work with him in prayer, and that I felt he needed to know something about Christian Science. So I explained some of the same things, especially with regard to sensing spiritually, that I've been talking about this morning. And we talked about the importance of discovering his spiritual identity. I explained that we're going to mentally turn away from all of the mental pictures of him as a physical being. All of them. It was going to be difficult, but we were going to make this effort. And the next question was, well, okay, what do we have left? Who is this individual? And we talked about the spiritual sense, and I said there are characteristics that are visible, audible, feelable to your spiritual sense that we need to bring into focus. And I explained to him there are different ways that the founder of Christian Science had identified God, and that what we were going to do in our prayer really was see essentially that he was a child of God. But in the literal sense, he was the creation of this creator. And that this creator, we had to get clear certain facts about God, namely, because there's always this challenge that God is infinitely good, but somehow creates evil. That God is infinitely loving, but punishes sometimes to eternal damnation. And so we worked just from the standpoint of understanding God, not as a creator of evil, not as a punisher of man, but as love itself, as pure love, as not just a source, we'll call my soccer player Tom, not a source of Tom, but the only source, the only real Father, in that broad, purely spiritual sense, the only creator. And if that was the case, then we could begin to see Tom in terms of the nature of his source, of his Father, of God. And I explained that there were ways in which the founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, enables us to do this. We have, I think, for the most part, in religions of the world today, and especially in Christianity, gone way beyond the idea of this idea of God as, the white-bearded, august gentleman who's floating around on clouds. But we still have a problem in moving from that idea of God as a kind of superhuman being. And part of that comes from the way in which we refer to God. The Bible, Old and New Testaments, refer to God as He. Today, a lot of people refer to God as she as well, but whether he or she, unfortunately, that often calls up a picture of a human being. He, in English especially, other languages, you can use he, and it's not quite so focused on a human being. But we need to get away from that. And Mary Baker Eddy uses terms which enable us to do that, and in a very rich way. She uses terms, just as St. John did in his letter in the New Testament, as love, God as love, God as mind, God as truth, God as spirit, God as soul, God as principle. All of these ways of understanding God move us away from the superhuman being and into qualities, things that we can sense with our spiritual sense. We can begin to understand. And this is a way, really, of being able to redefine ourselves. And I explained some of these things to Tom. He was interested. He found it was at least worth a try. And we started talking about the ways in which we could redefine his identity. We could see him as the expression of love in his generosity, his kindness to others. We could see that he was an expression of truth, a creation of truth in his honesty, his sense of fair play. And in this way, we began to just redefine, really, who he really was. And he liked it. He felt that this was very helpful. And I said, well, okay, well, let's pray together on this. And over the next couple of days, I prayed. 2 days later, he called back to say that he was beyond pain with regard to his physical problem. He was sure that there was a healing. And I answered that, well, that's up to your coach, your parents, and so forth. And he felt that that he was absolutely sure. I myself was a little bit hesitant because I knew this was the beginning of the season. He really wanted to play. But he was so insistent that his parents agreed to have new x-rays. And the x-rays showed that there had been a complete healing. That, in fact, the doctor who made the x-rays was also on the faculty of a nearby medical school. And he asked that they be kept out as evidence of a healing process he'd never seen before. Well, Tom was able to play the rest of that season, became quite an athlete, in fact. But let's just take a moment and look what really happened there. Tom changed his thinking. He changed his picture of who he was. It was not radical, but it was enough so that he was able to align his thinking with laws. This is what Mary Baker explains as the basis of healing, the real laws which govern his existence. Not laws of matter, but laws of spirit, what Jesus referred to as the kingdom of God. And this is, in fact, the basis on which she herself healed, and in the first year after that breakthrough that she'd made, she wanted to test her understanding. She wanted, first of all, to deepen her understanding, and so she turned to the Bible. And in the next several years, she felt she was really discovering all kinds of things about what it was that Jesus was teaching to his students. But she wanted to test them at the same time. She had this kind of natural scientific bent that if this wasn't a special gift that she had, but especially if it wasn't something mysterious and supernatural, but it was based on spiritual sense, spiritual understanding, then she'd be able to heal. And she found she was. In that first year, she healed a case of dumbness, a case of physical deformity, clubfoot, a case of cancer, tuberculosis. And beyond that, she recognized, okay, now she had this essentially proved that it was something that was based on this spiritual sense. But could she communicate that to someone else? This would really be the final proof that it wasn't something that was a especially endowed gift, or that it wasn't something that was supernatural. And just as with Jesus' students were not the intellectual elite of his day. They were simple fishermen. So with her first student was a simple cobbler living in a little town north of Boston. And she found that she was able, through teaching, to enable him to use spiritual sense as a basis of healing. And that was kind of in a sense, the final proof that she needed to go ahead with this whole structure of a church that would be able to teach how to heal in this way. One of the challenges that came up in my own experience, this was before I became a practitioner, when I was still connected with the University of Pittsburgh, was an attempt. This was I was associated with an institution that brought together black and white students in the university around the question of racism. It was a project that was really designed in response to a horrible racial riot in the city and disturbances within all of the educational institutions, especially the University of Pittsburgh. But an attempt to bring together both black and white students, but not in the usual way of attempting to integrate, but rather recognize that each had its own culture, This was a living unit. The students who participated in it were full-time students, but they were also individuals who were really dedicated to exploring racism, seeing how we could destroy it, really. Understand it in such a way that it could be healed, both in the university as well as the urban context. And initially, the university was excited, gave full-time scholarships to all of the students who participated. But after several years, the enthusiasm waned. It was established in 1970. By the 80s, the willingness of the university to participate had diminished to the point where they thought they could spend their money better elsewhere. I was shocked. It was clear that we were making progress in this institution. Subsequently, the YWCA awarded it with its Racial Justice Award for the good work that it had been doing. But for the university, it was apparently a financial burden. And my reaction was not very generous. I felt that this is according to a lot of stereotypes of university politics, where the administrators sort of do their thing, and it doesn't have much to do with education, so it often is condemned. And that's what they were to me. And not only bureaucrats, but racist bureaucrats who didn't recognize that this is a problem which was, even though there weren't eruptions in cities, racial riots in the United States, it was still an enormous problem. And I must say, up to that point in our meetings, I restrained from using any inflammatory language, but my thought was inflamed, and I made no progress, really, whatsoever in convincing anyone of these ideas. The last meeting in an attempt to negotiate was coming up, and I realized that what I've just described to you is not the way I should be thinking. That my identification of these individuals, especially mental condemnation, was just not seeing them as God's creation, and that was the way I needed to see them. That if you would ask me, I would have explained that, well, of course, I saw all these individuals as members of my family. Our mother, father, God brought us together. We were equally brothers and sisters, children of God. And yet, clearly, I had identified them in exactly the opposite way, rather the children of all kinds of bad things. And I prayed, and really just to change that picture, to begin just mentally to move it out of my thinking. But that meant I had, just as when I was working with Tom, I had to redefine them. I had to start with God as the cause and recognize this was the only cause of their business, of their existence, of their nature. And this is what happens when we get into habits of thought. And this is why I think that metaphor of the wolf boy is so relevant, because the wolf boy had accumulated habits of thought which were inappropriate to his real nature. And again, this is what Jesus was concerned with. We've all gathered habits of thought that are contrary to our real nature. We need to get rid of those habits of thought. We need to see ourselves differently. And I finally was able to get to the point where I not only was able to sense that these were not the horrible bureaucrats or racists, but that they actually were children of God, that they were the image and likeness of God. And as such, I could see their divine nature, at least to some degree. I felt that I could love them. Well, I was apprehensive. The meeting began. I kind of just laid out the basic issues. And the first person to respond was the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, who said that they had concluded that the day before, when they had met, that they were going to not only continue to support the project, but fund the salary and tuition of a resident director. This was more than we dared hope for. But for me, it was proof that this basis of healing was a natural result, really, of accurate identification. Removing the false picture, the false identity. And I had another of these experiences somewhat later. And this was, we're going to go back in time here. And perhaps you in Canada, and I'm sure you in Canada, didn't experience the Cold War the way we American citizens did. We went through a very thorough attempt at brainwashing, which is what you have to do in war. You know, you have to be trained to hate the enemy. And I was a product of that. Hating the enemy. The enemy in the Cold War was, of course, the communists. I was lecturing in Germany, and at that point there was West Germany and East Germany, and there were some lectures that I was going to be giving in Berlin. Christian Science lectures, one similar to this one. I didn't call them things at that point. And in order to get from West Germany to Berlin, you had to either fly in or drive. I drove through about 2.5 hours of East German countryside. And as I was driving, I noticed, of course, the farmers farming, doing their natural farming activities. But my immediate thought was, communists. The incarnation of evil. At that reaction, that thought that I had, but it was very strong. And I realized the degree to which I had kind of unwittingly accumulated this habit of thinking, and realized it was not going to be helpful to my thinking, especially if I was going to be giving lectures in West Berlin. And I started really doing some of the same things that I've talked about this morning, trying to identify them accurately, and especially working with that sense of fatherhood, of the fact that these were creations of my Father. And I was careful to recognize that I was accurately identifying their Father as well as mine. And there was another element that I worked with, and that was that we were one. This is something that comes out in Jesus' teaching, interestingly, and I think it's a kind of crucial aspect of discovering our spiritual identity, and that is to see that we're not separate creations. We are creations of God, but I'm going to just pass over this rapidly. This is a conflation. It means, of course, that you're bringing two stories together and interpreting them as though it's one story. And theologians, of course, have conflated the first and second stories of creation in the Bible. The first story in which God is identified as Elohim, and his creation is completely good, pure, perfect. Man is godlike. And the second story, which is where God is Yahweh, written so by a different person at a totally different period, and the story in which there's a totally different picture of man. Man is now material, not godlike, made of the dust of the earth, and man succumbs to the temptation of eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore is eliminated. And this is, I think it's interesting. The second story is an incredibly insightful story because it pinpoints the problem of mankind, namely to feel that we are separated from God, and that that's based on a lie. There was the liar, the serpent, who gave that information that if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then the liar told Adam and Eve that their eyes would be opened and they would become as God. And it was accepting that lie that was the basis of God excluding them from the Garden of Eden. Now they're out having to live by the sweat of their brow and in pain and difficulty. But that was a lie. And this is this wonderful insight that there has never been a separation. If we understand that that's a misconception of man, and that misconception has been the basis of really our suffering, our identifying ourselves as separate somehow from God. And so this understanding of man as at one with God, never separated from God. Again, this is from John, and it's his prayer on the eve of the crucifixion, where he says, he's praying both for his students and for himself to God. Neither pray I for these alone, but for them also which shall believe on me through their word, that they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. And he goes on, and the glory which thou gavest me, I have given them, that they may be one, even as we are one, I in them and thou in me, that they may be perfect in one. And that sense, it's difficult, again, we are using a language which results from our physical experience. So this is a nature of oneness which isn't, in other words, man is not God, but man is so at one with God that there isn't, it's impossible to imagine that there's a separation. Now, again, we don't have a language, and you can feel him kind of struggling with the language here. He uses a spatial metaphor, same one Paul did when he said that, referring to God, in him we live and move and have our being. So it's one in the other. It's not really in space, it's just in the sense of inseparable, sense of totally at one. Well, I recognized this was what I needed to see for myself and for these East German farmers. And I was asked to lecture in East Berlin. The Christian Science had been the first religion that the East German government had outlawed. It was very severely punished to identify oneself as a Christian Scientist in that context. But Germans, ingenious individuals that they are, had devised a means of having, quote, lectures. They had a birthday party. And someone with a large apartment would invite other people to the birthday party. And I crossed over with two West German friends who were wonderfully helpful and gave the lecture in that context. And it was wonderful. There were wonderful questions and answers afterwards. And when we came back through the checkpoint, my two friends were told to go on ahead, that they wouldn't see me anymore. And then I was told that, I was shown, in fact, some photographs. We opened our briefcases when we came in, and they had secretly photographed what was inside. And then he noticed when I came back that there were magazines and there were books that were no longer there. This was a very, very serious crime. And they couldn't tell me what the punishment was going to be, but they knew it was going to be severe to fit the crime. And they ushered me into a special office of the commandant. But this time I was prepared. There was the Nazi uniform. And I was able to see through it. I was able to sense really the child of God that individual was. It was something that I won't forget, because the temptation, it was almost as though he was trying to keep a straight face as, this severe punisher. And I loved him. And I decided just to describe simply and openly what I was doing. I said that I love the Bible, and we were talking about the Bible and what its message was, and that there was a messenger, a person who had a wonderful interpretation of the meaning of the Bible, and I, in the process, mentioned how much I loved the Luther translation, which is beautiful, and which is it is to the German language what the King James translation of the Bible is to the English language. It informs it. It gives it a wonderful poetic basis. And at that point, he was, I could see kind of thinking, and he looked up at me and he said, well, he was from Eisleben. That's the hometown of Luther. And he looked at me and he said, and you look a little bit like the young Luther. And then he complimented me on my German, and I knew that I was free. He said a few more things about how serious the offense was, and that I should never, ever do it again, but, he let me go. And I left and went on further, and I discovered my two West Berlin friends who had not gone on, had stayed and prayed. But to me, that was a kind of verification of the power of accurate identification. The fact that we need this constant care not to allow these false habits of thought, and especially false pictures that are so thoroughly ingrained in our thinking, that we need to make an effort, a major effort, to eliminate them. And I want to leave a little time for questions and answers, but I want to leave you with a challenge. And this is because I've attended, they weren't called Thinks, but I've attended lectures at which there were some really, I thought, helpful ideas that I could use, quite consciously in my own experience. And, well, let's see, it's Saturday morning, kind of busy tomorrow, but Monday in the oh no, I've got that appointment in the afternoon. And eventually, I never got around to consciously using some of the ideas. Thus the challenge. And I hope you'll take it, and it means some homework. The challenge is to identify 7 divine qualities that you feel they're not the easiest, they're most natural for you. Divine qualities like maybe generosity, loving in the sense of never criticizing, something which is a pattern of behavior, a way of identifying yourself. And I'm suggesting that you choose those ones which don't feel the most comfortable, the ones that you would be not the immediate to identify yourself if you were describing yourself to someone else as. Identify 7, and then in the next 7 days, see yourself, redefine yourself as the full expression of that quality. And the basis for my making this challenge is the recognition that if God is your only creator. And I'm convinced that that's the case. Then all of the qualities of God, you're the image and likeness of God. There are none of the divine qualities that are not a part of you. We're brought up to think, well, each individual is different. And of course, that's true. We all reflect these qualities differently. But we all reflect all of these qualities. And if we, in our self-identification, we recognize none of the qualities of God are beyond our reach, are beyond our ability to express, to reflect, then it follows that you can choose even the most challenging of these qualities as characterizing your nature. And it's as we redefine ourselves mentally in this way that we really redefine our lives. We're repenting. There's a statement that Jesus makes, according to Matthew. It's the very beginning of his public ministry. He says, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And the term repent is the Greek term metanoeo is quite a challenge to people who want to translate the Bible. I'm going to give you just some of the ways in which modern translations have translated that word, because it indicates the importance of looking out from a different perspective, changing the point from which we're seeing. These are some of the ways in which that verb is translated. Turn from the world to God. Change your inner self. Change your old way of thinking. Live your life in a new way. This is from J.B. Phillips, a translation I love. You must change your hearts. Well, you can see this meta is a term meaning anew, freshly. Noeo is to understand, to perceive. So in order to understand anew, what is it that we're understanding? We're understanding that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. We're changing our perspective, and we're becoming aware of the fact that this kingdom is here. We're in it. And we are the full manifestation of God, the full reflection of God. Well, this is essentially what I'm asking you to do. It's to metanoeo, to change radically your way of seeing yourself. And I've specified, I think what I've suggested is a good way to do it, because it gives you a day in which to make that new identification, to kind of change your picture of yourself into this new godlike shape. You've been a wonderful audience. Thanks very, very, very much.